J.I. Packer died recently at a good old age. He was one of the theological leaders of the evangelical movement in the second half of the 20th century. Almost 30 years ago, as a young Christian at university, I read his classic book, Knowing God. It is a wonderfully nourishing introduction to Christian theology, written for lay people. It has fed the faith of generations of Christians. The language is old now and concise and takes some digesting, but there is a feast to savour on every page. Something that has stayed with me from Knowing God is what Jim Packer writes in chapter 5 about the Incarnation of Christ. I know it's not Christmas, but who knows what Christmas will look like in 2020, so I thought I'd get in early. Jim Packer writes that the Christmas message rests on the staggering fact that the child in the manger was God. Other biblical affirmations about Jesus are hard to believe on face value. The virgin birth? Miracles? How could the death of one man on a Roman cross atone for the sins of the world? Resurrection from the dead? How could he return to heaven and promise to be with his followers always? These are challenging beliefs to hold, but they pale in comparison with the Christmas claim. Packer declares, nothing in fiction is so fantastic as is this truth of the Incarnation. If, however, Jesus is God in human flesh, then the rest becomes plausible. Jim Packer writes, the Incarnation itself is an unfathomable mystery, but it makes sense of everything else in the New Testament. Grasp this, and you get the whole gospel. Another Anglican theologian, Alistair McGrath, writes that the Incarnation provides us with a window into God's heart and a doorway into his presence. Over the next 4 weeks, as we explore the Incarnation, I invite you to look through that window and step through that doorway with me. The challenge of understanding this mighty mystery of the Incarnation led to disagreements and divisions in the first 4 centuries of the Church. Did God the Son set his divinity or some of it aside to become human? Was he God, but not really human, dressed in skin as a disguise, like a superhero's mask? Was he a man later adopted as divine by God or Christian tradition? Was he actually 2 people, a divine one and a human one, in the same body? No, none of these answers accounts satisfactorily for all the biblical evidence. According to the famous definition from the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, only one way of understanding the Incarnation of Christ is faithful to the biblical witness. Jesus Christ is one person in 2 natures, truly God and truly human. He is the God-man. This is the classic doctrinal definition, but Richard Bauckham observes that the Church's doctrinal definitions are not, of course, in any sense substitutes for the apostolic witness to Christ in the New Testament. They are formulated essentially as guides to read the gospel story of Jesus. Over the next few weeks, we're going to turn to various passages in the New Testament and ask about the significance of the Incarnation of Christ. We begin with the opening verses of John's Gospel, where we find that the Incarnation took place to reveal God the Father to us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. As you read the verses that follow, it becomes clear that the Word is a way of talking about the Son of God, the one who was with God in the beginning and who was God, self-existent in eternity before time, the one through whom all things were made. That was in the beginning. Then something happened, an act of singular, breathtaking mystery and beauty and humility and glory. Eternity stepped into time. Deity took on humanity. Mary gave birth to her Maker and laid him in a manger. God the Son left his rightful place of glory beside the Father on the throne of heaven and was born into earthly poverty and obscurity as Jesus of Nazareth. In John's words, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. John goes on to write, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. He is the Word made flesh, God the Son incarnate, the one who makes God the Father visible, the one who makes God known. If you want to see God, look at Jesus. We do that today in the pages of the Bible. Here is our first profound lesson about the purpose of the Incarnation. Don Carson puts it like this: do you want to know what the character of God is like? Study Jesus. Do you want to know what the holiness of God is like? Study Jesus. Do you want to know what the wrath of God is like? Study Jesus. Do you want to know what the forgiveness of God is like? Study Jesus. Do you want to know what the glory of God is like? Study Jesus all the way to that wretched cross. Study Jesus. Now, it isn't just that the Incarnation happened in order to make God known, but also that the very Incarnation itself makes God known. So what does the Incarnation reveal about God? In history and today, there are religions that see physical life as less than spiritual life, inferior, impermanent, illusory, even immoral. By contrast, the Word became flesh. What an extraordinary affirmation of material creation and of human life. God, who is Spirit, stepped into the material world and into the personal experience of embodied human life. When God looks at you, he sees you as a whole person. And your future as a Christian is to live as a whole person in a world made whole again in God's kingdom. The Incarnation is God's profoundest affirmation of creation and human life. Has the pandemic left you wondering if God cares very much about the world or us? Remember the Incarnation and be reminded of how deeply God values his creation and his image-bearing creatures. It's even better than that. the Incarnation also reveals the depths of God's commitment to being in relationship with us. Let's come back again to John's famous description of the Incarnation. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, if you're a Greek reader of the Bible, the language of making his dwelling among us points you back to the Old Testament tabernacle and the temple that followed it. We could even translate John 1 verse 14, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. The tabernacle and the temple were God's provision of a way for him to dwell in the midst of his people, for God to be present with his people. In the language of Isaiah and Matthew, Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, to dwell among us, to walk beside us, and now, by the Holy Spirit, to live in us and be with us always. Has the pandemic or some personal circumstance left you feeling forsaken by God? Remember the Incarnation and know that you have not been abandoned. We will see in coming weeks that the Incarnation is part of the bigger story that includes Jesus' birth and life, his words and works, his death and resurrection, his ascension and his promised return. We can only understand any one part of the Jesus story when all the parts are joined up. Today, I encourage you to stop and marvel and cultivate a sense of wonder at the unfathomable mystery that Jesus Christ is God incarnate, God with us. God be with you.